Tonight we uncover the most dangerous secret in human history, a cover-up so massive, so perfectly executed, that it has shaped every religion, every government, every classroom for over 1,000 years. This isn't about scandals you've heard before. This is about something far deeper, something that would shatter the foundation of everything you believe about the past, about power, and about who really controls the narrative of human civilization. You think you know history. You think you know truth. But what if I told you that the timeline itself has been altered, that entire centuries were manufactured, that gods became demons, that ancient knowledge was not lost, but stolen and buried beneath layers of lies so thick that even those who guard them have forgotten what lies beneath? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we enter the Vatican's deepest vault. And what we find there will change everything you thought you knew about the biggest cover-up in history. What you're about to hear comes from someone who was inside, someone who walked the forbidden halls, read the burned texts, touched the evidence they never wanted you to see. I know because I was there. I held the keys to rooms that don't exist on any map. And now, for the first time, I'm going to tell you everything. The cover-up didn't start with a meeting or a decree. It started with a discovery. Something found in the desert of Egypt in 1798 that was so dangerous, so world-shattering that within months every major power in Europe was scrambling to control it. Napoleon himself sealed the chamber where it was found. But what they discovered there was only the beginning. Picture this. French soldiers digging near an ancient temple, expecting to find gold or artifacts. Instead, they uncover a library. But not just any library. This was a repository of texts that predated the Bible by thousands of years. Scrolls that told the same stories as Genesis, but with different names, different gods, different truths. The creation myth, the flood, the first humans, paradise itself, all written in languages older than Hebrew, older than civilization as we know it. But here's where it gets dangerous. These texts didn't just tell the same stories. They told the real stories, the ones that came before the edits, before the rewrites, before the Vatican decided which version of history would survive and which would burn. The French expedition leader, a man named Bouchard, sent word back to Rome immediately. He understood what they had found. Proof that the Bible was not divine revelation, but a carefully edited version of much older myths. Within weeks, representatives from the Vatican were on ships heading to Egypt, not to study the texts, but to control them. You see, the Church had always known this day would come. For centuries they had been collecting and hiding these older texts, these inconvenient truths that threatened their monopoly on divine authority. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi Library, countless manuscripts from Mesopotamia, all quietly acquired and buried in vaults beneath Rome. But the Egyptian discovery was different. It was complete. It was organized. And worst of all, it was documented by the French, which meant the secret was already spreading beyond their control dot. So they made a decision that would echo through history. If they couldn't hide the discovery, they would hide the meaning. They would create the greatest cover-up in human history, a systematic campaign to rewrite not just books, but the entire understanding of human civilization. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. First, they would claim authority over all archaeological expeditions in the region. Using their influence with Catholic nations across Europe, They positioned Vatican scholars as the primary translators and interpreters of ancient texts. If you wanted to study the past, you had to go through Rome. Second, they would flood the academic world with their own versions of history. Thousands of books, papers, and translations, all carefully crafted to support the biblical narrative while subtly discrediting anything that contradicted it. They didn't need to destroy the evidence. They just needed to control how it was interpreted. Third, and most ingeniously, they would hide their biggest secrets in plain sight. The Vatican Library, they announced, would be opened to scholars for the first time in centuries. But what they didn't say was that the truly dangerous texts would never see those shelves. Those would remain in the secret archives, the Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, locked away from the world. But they made one crucial mistake. They trusted too many people with pieces of the truth. Priests, archivists, scholars, translators, all of them sworn to secrecy, all of them carrying fragments of the real story. And some of those fragments survived. I was one of those trusted few. For 15 years I served in the deepest levels of the Vatican archives. My job was simple: catalog and preserve the texts that were too dangerous to destroy, but too damning to reveal. I thought I was protecting holy truth. I was actually maintaining history's greatest lie. The first text I saw that changed everything was written in ancient Sumerian. It was the story of creation, but not the Genesis version. This one was older, more detailed, and completely different. In this version, humans were not created by a loving God who wanted companions. They were created by advanced beings called the Anunnaki as a labor force, a slave race to mine gold and maintain their cities. The text described how these beings, not gods but flesh and blood entities with advanced technology, came to Earth from a dying planet. How they genetically modified early humans to create a worker species. How they established the first civilizations, taught the first sciences, and ruled as gods until a cataclysm forced them to leave. But here's what made my hands shake as I read it. Every detail of this Sumerian account had been carefully woven into the Bible, but with the truth inverted. The Anunnaki became fallen angels. Their genetic experiments became divine creation. Their technology became miracles. Their departure became the establishment of human free will. The Bible wasn't wrong. It was edited. Masterfully, deliberately edited to turn history into mythology and science into faith. As I dug deeper into the archives, the pattern became undeniable. Text after text, scroll after scroll, all telling variations of the same story. Advanced beings who came to Earth established civilization and then vanished, leaving behind only traces in the mythologies of every culture on the planet. The Sumerian tablets called them Anunnaki. The Hindu texts called them Devas. The Greek myths called them Titans. The Bible called them fallen angels or Nephilim. Different names, same entities, same story, all carefully reframed to support a single narrative: that humanity is alone in the universe, that our gods are purely spiritual, and that anyone who claims otherwise is dealing with demons. But the truth was there in the archives, hidden but not destroyed. Maps of the ancient world showing civilizations in places that were supposed to be uninhabited. Astronomical charts more accurate than anything we achieved until the modern era. Mathematical formulas that wouldn't be discovered again until centuries later. Technology described in such detail that modern engineers have been able to reconstruct working models. The cover-up wasn't just about religion. It was about rewriting the entire story of human civilization, making us believe we evolved slowly, naturally, in isolation, hiding the fact that we had help, guidance, technology that was then deliberately suppressed when our teachers left. And the Vatican wasn't the only institution involved. As the truth spread through the upper levels of various organizations, a shadow network formed. The Jesuits became the enforcement arm, traveling the world to acquire and bury inconvenient artifacts. Major universities were brought into the conspiracy, their archaeology and history departments carefully staffed with scholars who knew which questions not to ask. Museums became part of the cover-up too, displaying carefully selected artifacts while keeping the most revealing pieces in storage, locked away from public view. Government agencies in multiple countries established secret protocols for handling discoveries that might threaten the accepted timeline. But the most insidious part of the cover-up was how it changed education itself. History books were rewritten not just once, but continuously, each generation learning a version slightly more removed from the truth. Ancient achievements were attributed to human genius alone. Advanced technologies found in archaeological sites were labeled as religious symbols or primitive art. The timeline itself became a weapon. By establishing firm dates for human development, they could dismiss any evidence of advanced ancient civilizations as impossible, anachronistic, or fraudulent. If humans were supposed to be hunter-gatherers in 10,000 BC, then any evidence of advanced technology from that period had to be explained away or hidden. I spent years cataloging this evidence, thinking I was preserving it for future scholars. Instead, I was helping to bury it deeper. Every text I filed away, every artifact I documented and sealed, was another piece of human history disappearing into the void. The weight of what I was seeing eventually became unbearable. The realization that everything I had believed about human history, about the church, about the nature of reality itself, was built on carefully constructed lies. That my entire life had been spent serving an institution that had stolen the truth from humanity and replaced it with a sanitized version designed to keep us ignorant and controllable. But the breaking point came when I found the Black Archive, a section so secret that even most Vatican insiders didn't know it existed. Documents sealed behind locks that required multiple keys, held by different officials who were never allowed to be in the same room together. In the Black Archive were the original texts, the ones from which all the edited versions had been created. The real Genesis describing not divine creation, but genetic engineering. The true account of the flood, caused not by divine wrath, but by a polar shift that the advanced beings had predicted and planned for. The actual history of human civilization, rising and falling multiple times as our teachers came and went. Most shocking of all were the communications. Letters, reports, minutes from meetings dating back centuries showing how the cover-up had been planned, implemented, and maintained. Names of popes, emperors, scholars, and politicians all working together to keep humanity in the dark about its own past. The scope was breathtaking. Every major historical event had been carefully documented and then officially misrepresented. Wars fought over ancient technology were recorded as religious conflicts. Expeditions to recover advanced artifacts were disguised as exploration or conquest. Entire civilizations that didn't fit the approved timeline were written out of history altogether. And in the most recent files, dating to just a few years before I arrived, were plans for the modern era. How to handle satellite imagery that revealed ancient structures. How to discredit researchers who got too close to the truth. How to use the internet and social media to flood the world with so much disinformation that real evidence would be lost in the noise. That's when I realized I couldn't be part of it anymore. That my oath to God was being used to serve something far more earthly and sinister. The church I had devoted my life to wasn't protecting divine truth. It was protecting human power. The power that comes from controlling what people believe about their own past and potential. The night I decided to leave, I made copies. Not everything, that would have been impossible and detected immediately. But I took photographs, notes, key documents that proved the existence of the cover-up and outlined its scope. Evidence that humanity deserves to see, regardless of the consequences. Walking out of the Vatican for the last time was the hardest thing I had ever done. But staying would have made me complicit in the biggest lie ever told. A lie so vast that it has shaped the consciousness of our entire species. Now, years later, I'm finally ready to break my silence. Not because I want to destroy faith, but because I believe truth is stronger than any lie, no matter how carefully constructed. And because I believe humanity is ready to know what really happened in our past, what we really are, and what we might become if we stop accepting the limitations that have been placed on our understanding. The cover-up didn't just steal our history. It stole our future. By making us believe we are alone, primitive, and dependent on outside authority for truth, it has kept us from realizing our actual potential. From understanding that we are the descendants of a species that once worked alongside advanced beings that built civilizations we can barely imagine, and that has the capacity to reach for the stars themselves. But the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it's buried. And once you see it, once you understand the magnitude of what has been hidden from us, you can never go back to believing the simple stories they want us to accept. The cover-up is real. The evidence exists. And in the coming chapters, I'm going to show you exactly how they did it, what they found, and what it means for every single person on this planet. Because the biggest secret in human history isn't about the past. It's about who we really are and what we're really capable of once we stop believing their lies. The Black Archive wasn't just a room. It was a tomb for truth itself, located 7 levels beneath the Vatican Library, behind doors that required 3 different keys held by 3 different cardinals who were never allowed to meet together. It contained the evidence that would rewrite everything you think you know about human history. First time I descended those stairs, my hands trembling as I carried the ancient brass key that had been passed down through generations of archivists, I thought I was entering a holy sanctuary. I was actually walking into the vault where humanity's stolen memories lay buried under centuries of careful lies. You want to know what they're really hiding down there? You want to understand why the Vatican has spent over 1,000 years perfecting the art of historical manipulation? Then follow me into the darkness, because what I found in those sealed chambers will shatter every assumption you've ever had about our past, our origins, and our true potential as a species. The Black Archive contained 847 original tablets from the Sumerian civilization. Not copies, not fragments, but complete, intact records written in cuneiform by people who lived over 6,000 years ago. These weren't museum pieces gathering dust. They were actively studied, translated, and most importantly, suppressed by a secret council of Vatican scholars who had been working for centuries to keep their contents from reaching the public. The tablets told a story that the Church could never allow to be heard, a story of beings called the Anunnaki who arrived on Earth 450,000 years ago, not as spiritual entities but as physical beings with advanced technology, seeking resources to save their dying home planet. They came here for gold, needed to repair their atmosphere, and when they found that mining it themselves was too labor-intensive, they created a species to do the work for them. The tablets didn't describe divine creation. They described genetic engineering, detailed accounts of how the Anunnaki took the existing hominid species on Earth and modified their DNA, combining it with their own genetic material to create humans who were intelligent enough to follow complex instructions but limited enough to remain obedient. Workers. Reading those translations was like watching the foundation of everything I believed crumble in real time. The story of Adam and Eve wasn't metaphor or divine revelation. It was a simplified, sanitized version of scientific records describing the first genetically modified humans, created in what the Sumerians called the laboratory of the gods. But the tablets contained something even more dangerous than the truth about human origins. They contained maps, star charts showing the exact location of the Anunnaki home planet, Nibiru, and its orbital path around our solar system, technical diagrams of their spacecraft, their mining operations, their cities, mathematical formulas describing technologies that we're only beginning to understand today. Most shocking of all were the detailed records of their departure. The tablets described how the Anunnaki, having extracted what they needed from Earth, prepared to leave. But they faced a problem. The human species they had created had multiplied beyond their ability to control. Some humans had even begun to interbreed with the Anunnaki themselves, creating a hybrid race that was far more intelligent and capable than originally intended. The solution was brutal and efficient. A global catastrophe, carefully planned and executed. What we call the Great Flood wasn't divine punishment for human sin. It was a deliberate genocide, designed to reduce the human population to manageable numbers while preserving a small group of obedient survivors who would remember the Anunnaki as gods and pass down that memory through religious traditions. The tablets named names, specific Anunnaki leaders who orchestrated the flood, the exact location of their base of operations, even the coordinates of underground facilities where they stored technology and records before departing Earth, and most importantly, they described the system they put in place to ensure that humans would never again develop beyond a certain level of technological and spiritual advancement. That system was religion itself. Before leaving Earth, the Anunnaki established what they called the Containment Protocol, a set of belief systems designed to keep humans focused on spiritual salvation rather than technological development, on obedience to divine authority rather than scientific exploration, on the afterlife rather than improving their conditions on Earth. they selected certain humans to serve as intermediaries, priests who would maintain these belief systems and ensure they were passed down through generations. These priests were given limited access to advanced knowledge, just enough to seem miraculous to the general population, but not enough to actually advance human civilization beyond safe parameters. The tablets described how this system was designed to be self-maintaining. Each generation of priests would select and train their successors, passing down both the public religious teachings and the secret knowledge of what they were really doing. Over time, most priests would forget the original purpose and genuinely believe they were serving divine beings, rather than maintaining a control system established by departed aliens. But the Vatican knew. The highest levels of the Church had always known, because they were the inheritors of the original containment protocol. Not servants of God, but custodians of an alien control system designed to keep humanity trapped in a perpetual state of condition, technological and spiritual adolescence. Reading this, understanding what it meant, was like waking up from a dream only to realize that the dream was the only reality you had ever known. Everything I had dedicated my life to, every prayer I had offered, every Mass I had celebrated, was part of a vast machine designed to keep our entire species from reaching its true potential. But the tablets revealed something else, something that gave me hope even as it shattered my faith. The Anunnaki had made a crucial miscalculation. They had assumed that the genetic modifications they made to create humans would remain stable over time. They didn't account for the fact that consciousness itself would evolve, that humans would gradually develop beyond the limitations originally built into their DNA. The evidence was all around us. If you knew what to look for, humans who displayed abilities that shouldn't be possible according to the original design parameters. Individuals who could access what seemed like supernatural knowledge, who could heal with touch, who could influence matter with thought. The Church called these people saints and mystics, carefully controlling their stories and ensuring they were seen as rare exceptions blessed by God rather than examples of human potential breaking free from artificial constraints. The tablets described this evolution as inevitable. Consciousness, they explained, was not a product of the brain, but something that used the brain as an interface. As human consciousness continued to evolve, more and more individuals would begin to access capabilities that had been suppressed by the original genetic modifications. This was the Vatican's greatest fear. Not that people would stop believing in God, but that they would start believing in themselves. Not that humanity would lose faith, but that it would discover its true potential and no longer need the control systems that had been put in place to contain it. The Black Archive contained detailed plans for dealing with this eventuality, protocols for identifying individuals who showed signs of advanced capabilities, methods for either recruiting them into the Church where they could be controlled or neutralizing them through various means, instructions for maintaining the illusion of divine miracle while actually suppressing any genuine breakthrough in human consciousness. I found files on historical figures who had been managed by these protocols, scientists whose discoveries had been stolen and their work credited to others, inventors whose technologies had been acquired and then buried, spiritual teachers whose messages had been co-opted and corrupted to support existing power structures. The scope of the cover-up was breathtaking. Every major advancement in human civilization had been carefully monitored and guided to ensure it didn't threaten the fundamental control system. Wars had been started to prevent certain discoveries from spreading. Entire libraries had been burned to destroy inconvenient knowledge. Scholars had been recruited, corrupted, or eliminated to maintain the approved version of history. But perhaps most insidiously, the Church had become the guardian of humanity's stolen memories. Every culture on earth had originally preserved oral traditions describing the time when gods walked among humans, teaching them agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, and technology. The Church had systematically collected these traditions, rewritten them as mythology, and replaced them with sanitized religious narratives that supported the control system. The result was a species that had been cut off from its own past, convinced that it had evolved slowly and naturally from primitive beginnings, unaware that its ancestors had once worked alongside advanced beings and possessed technologies that modern science was only beginning to rediscover. I spent months in the Black Archive, photographing documents, copying translations, trying to understand the full scope of what had been hidden from humanity. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Our entire understanding of human history, human potential, and human purpose had been deliberately constructed to keep us ignorant and manageable. The hardest part wasn't just learning the truth. It was realizing how perfectly the system worked. Most people, even when presented with evidence, would reject it outright because it contradicted everything they had been taught to believe about reality. The control system was so deeply embedded in human consciousness that it had become self-defending, but there were cracks in the system. Individuals who questioned too much, who pushed too hard against the boundaries of accepted knowledge. The Church had developed elaborate methods for dealing with these people, either bringing them into the fold where they could be monitored and controlled, or discrediting them so thoroughly that their ideas would never gain traction. I had seen the files on modern heretics, scientists, who had gotten too close to understanding the true nature of consciousness. Archaeologists who had discovered artifacts that didn't fit the approved timeline. Inventors who had developed technologies that threatened existing power structures. All of them carefully managed, their work buried or redirected to serve the system, rather than liberate humanity from it. The most recent files in the Black Archive dealt with the digital age and how to maintain control in an era when information could spread instantly across the globe. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Flood the internet with so much disinformation that truth would become impossible to distinguish from fiction. Create so many competing conspiracy theories that genuine evidence would be lost in the noise. They had turned the internet itself into a weapon of control, using humanity's own desire for hidden knowledge against itself. For every real truth that surfaced online, they would create dozens of false ones, ensuring that anyone seeking genuine information would become lost in a maze of deliberately planted misinformation. But they had made one crucial error. They had assumed that consciousness evolution would continue to be a rare, individual phenomenon that could be managed on a case-by-case basis. They hadn't anticipated that it might reach a critical mass where enough humans would simultaneously begin to access their true potential, making the old control methods ineffective. The signs were everywhere, if you knew what to look for. People around the world were reporting experiences that didn't fit the approved model of reality. Intuitive insights, telepathic communications, healing abilities, and most importantly, a growing sense that something fundamental about our understanding of human potential was incomplete. This was why I had to leave, why I had to break my oath of silence and share what I had learned. Not because I wanted to destroy people's faith, but because I believed humanity deserved to know the truth about what it really was and what it was really capable of achieving. The Anunnaki were gone, but their control system remained maintained by institutions that no longer even remembered why they were maintaining it. Breaking free from that system wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. It required nothing more than enough humans simultaneously awakening to the truth about their own nature and refusing to accept the limitations that had been artificially imposed on them. The Black Archive contained the evidence. The tablets told the story. The cover-up was real, vast, and still ongoing. But the truth, no matter how carefully buried, has a way of surfacing when the time is right. And I believe that time is now. They knew I had been in the Black Archive longer than authorized. The moment I stepped out of that chamber with copies of humanity's stolen history hidden in my robes, I could feel the weight of their surveillance. After 15 years of faithful service, I had become a liability, a keeper of secrets who might not keep them secret anymore. You think walking away from the Vatican is as simple as handing in your resignation? You think they just let you leave with a handshake and a blessing after you've seen what I've seen? Let me tell you how the world's most powerful institution handles those who know too much. Let me show you the machinery they've built to silence truth-tellers and protect their 1,000-year-old lie. The Jesuits weren't just missionaries and educators. They were the Vatican's intelligence agency, a shadow organization that had been perfecting the art of information control for centuries. And I was about to discover firsthand just how far they would go to protect the cover-up that defined their very existence. My first warning came through Father Rodriguez, a man I had worked with for years in the archives. He appeared at my quarters 3 days after my unauthorized visit to the Black Archive, his face pale with concern that seemed genuine but felt rehearsed. "Brother Marcus," he said, using the formal address he had abandoned years earlier, "there are questions being asked about your recent activities. Questions that would be better answered privately than through official channels." The message was clear. Someone knew about my extended time in the Forbidden Chamber. Someone was watching. Someone was preparing to act. But what Rodriguez didn't know was that I had already made my decision. The evidence I had photographed in the Black Archive wasn't just sitting in my quarters waiting to be discovered. I had spent the previous 3 nights carefully copying the most crucial documents, creating multiple sets of insurance that would survive even if I didn't. The Sumerian tablets' translations were hidden in places throughout Rome where the Vatican's reach couldn't easily extend. Digital copies uploaded to servers in countries where the Church held little political influence. Physical copies stored in safety deposit boxes registered under names that couldn't be traced back to me. I had learned from studying the files of previous problem priests who had gotten too close to dangerous truths. The Church's method was always the same: isolate, discredit, and eliminate. First, they would remove the individual from positions of authority and access. Then they would systematically destroy their reputation within religious and academic circles. Finally, if necessary, they would ensure permanent silence through methods that appeared accidental or natural. But I had advantages that previous truth-seekers hadn't possessed. 15 years of deep access had taught me how their systems worked, where their vulnerabilities lay, and most importantly, who within the organization might be sympathetic to the cause of truth. There was a small network of Vatican insiders who had grown troubled by what they were being asked to protect. Archivists who had seen too much, translators who understood what they were really translating, priests whose faith had been shaken by the realization that they were serving something far more earthly than divine. We never met as a group. That would have been discovered immediately. Instead, we communicated through a system of coded messages hidden in routine administrative documents. A request for additional parchment that actually meant urgent. Information needs to be preserved. A requisition for candles that signaled external threat. Detected. A prayer schedule. Change that indicated prepare for emergency dispersal of evidence. Through this network, I learned that my situation was more precarious than I had realized. The Vatican had detected digital intrusions into their most secure systems. Someone had been carefully copying and transmitting their most sensitive files to outside locations. They suspected an inside operation, but hadn't yet identified the source. The investigation was being led by Cardinal Toretti, a man whose devotion to protecting church secrets was legendary even within Vatican walls. He had overseen the suppression of archaeological discoveries across 3 continents, managed the recruitment and elimination of problematic scholars, and personally directed the removal of inconvenient evidence from museums and universities worldwide. Toretti's methods were sophisticated and ruthless. He didn't simply destroy evidence. He replaced it with carefully crafted alternatives that supported the approved narrative. He didn't just silence researchers. He co-opted their work and redirected their conclusions to serve the Church's interests. But Toretti had a weakness that I could exploit. He was old school, trained in an era when information control meant physical control of documents and personal influence over key individuals. He understood the traditional methods of suppression, but was less familiar with the digital age's possibilities for evidence preservation and distribution. My network had been preparing for this possibility for years. We had established secure communication channels outside Vatican control, created redundant storage systems for crucial evidence, and most importantly, identified sympathetic contacts in media and academic institutions who could serve as distribution points for information that needed to reach the public. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than trying to smuggle evidence out of the Vatican in a dramatic escape that would certainly be detected and prevented, we would make the information so widely distributed that suppressing it would be impossible. Multiple releases through different channels, each containing pieces of the larger puzzle, ensuring that even if some sources were compromised, enough truth would survive to expose the cover-up. But executing this plan required perfect timing and absolute secrecy. One mistake, one premature move, and centuries of carefully preserved evidence would be destroyed along with everyone who had tried to protect it. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sister Catherine, a young archivist who had recently been granted access to the medieval manuscript collection discovered something that changed everything. Hidden within the margins of a 12th century prayer book were notes written in a cipher that matched symbols found in the Sumerian tablets. The notes described a previous attempt to expose the cover-up, led by a group of Benedictine monks who had gained access to original Anunnaki records. The monks had tried to share their discoveries with the broader church, believing that truth would strengthen rather than threaten Christianity. They were wrong. The institutional church had moved swiftly to suppress their revelations, disbanding their monastery, scattering the monks to distant assignments, and ensuring that their discoveries disappeared into the depths of the Vatican archives. But the monks had been cleverer than their suppressors realized. Before their community was destroyed, they had created a comprehensive record of their findings and hidden multiple copies throughout European monasteries, encoded in ways that would allow future truth-seekers to reconstruct their work. Sister Catherine's discovery was a map, not a geographical map, but an intellectual one, showing the locations where evidence had been hidden and the methods for decoding the information. 8 centuries later, the monks' insurance policy was finally being activated. Working with contacts throughout Europe, our network began the careful process of locating and recovering the hidden records. Each piece confirmed and expanded what we had learned from the Black Archive. The pattern of cover-up stretched back much further than we had realized, involving not just the Vatican, but a coordinated effort by multiple institutions to suppress evidence of humanity's true origins. The recovered documents revealed that the Anunnaki hadn't simply departed Earth and left humanity to develop on its own. They had established a monitoring system, a network of human intermediaries who would ensure that civilization remained within safe parameters and that technology never advanced beyond controllable levels. These intermediaries weren't just religious leaders. They included political rulers, military commanders, merchant princes, and scholars, all of them bound by oaths that transcended any single institution or nationality, all of them dedicated to preserving a system that kept humanity ignorant of its true potential. The network had evolved over millennia, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining its core mission. Medieval guilds that controlled technological development, Renaissance academies that guided scientific research, modern corporations that acquired and buried inconvenient innovations, all connected by an ancient mandate to prevent humanity from breaking free of its imposed limitations. Understanding this larger structure explained why the Vatican's cover-up had been so successful for so long. They weren't working alone. They were part of a vast, coordinated effort that spanned cultures, centuries, and continents. An effort that had successfully convinced humanity that its current level of development was natural and inevitable rather than artificially imposed. But the same documents that revealed the scope of the conspiracy also showed its vulnerabilities. The system depended on secrecy, on keeping its various components isolated and unaware of the larger pattern. It also depended on humanity remaining passive, accepting the limitations that had been placed on its development. Both of these dependencies were breaking down in the modern era. Global communication was making it harder to keep secrets compartmentalized, and human consciousness was evolving beyond the parameters originally established, creating individuals who could no longer be controlled by traditional methods. The evidence suggested that we were approaching a critical juncture. Either the control system would successfully adapt to modern conditions and tighten its grip on human development, or enough people would awaken to the truth to break the system entirely. Our network chose to bet on awakening. The evidence we had gathered was too important to remain hidden, and the risk of continued suppression was too great to accept. Humanity deserved to know what it was, where it came from, and what it was capable of achieving. The coordinated release began with academic papers published simultaneously in multiple journals, carefully crafted to present evidence without making claims that could be easily dismissed as conspiracy theory. Archaeological findings that didn't fit accepted timelines. Linguistic analyses showing connections between ancient texts that suggested shared sources. Mathematical models demonstrating that human technological development had been artificially constrained. Each paper on its own might have been dismissed or suppressed. Together they created a pattern that demanded explanation. Media outlets began investigating. Independent researchers started connecting dots. Government agencies found themselves fielding questions they couldn't answer without revealing information they preferred to keep classified. Vatican's response was swift and sophisticated. Cardinal Terretti launched a multi-pronged campaign to discredit the emerging evidence. Academic institutions suddenly discovered financial pressures that forced them to distance themselves from controversial research. Media outlets found their access to Vatican sources restricted unless they maintained approved editorial positions. Researchers who pushed too hard encountered career obstacles that effectively silenced them. But the digital age had created opportunities that previous generations of truth seekers hadn't possessed. Evidence could be distributed instantly across global networks. Alternative media platforms could bypass traditional gatekeepers. Social media allowed direct communication between researchers and the public. For the first time in centuries, the forces of truth had technological advantages that matched or exceeded those of the forces of suppression. The question was whether they would be able to use those advantages effectively before the control system adapted to neutralize them. That's when I realized my role in this struggle couldn't end with simply preserving evidence for future scholars. The time for gradual revelation had passed. The evidence needed to reach the public directly, in forms that couldn't be suppressed or discredited through traditional channels. Leaving the Vatican wasn't about abandoning my faith. It was about serving a higher truth than any institution could contain. The real divine mystery wasn't hidden in ancient texts or secret archives. It was embodied in human potential itself, in the consciousness that was evolving beyond artificial limits, in the capacity for awakening that no control system could permanently suppress. The cover-up was vast, sophisticated, and centuries in the making. But it was also vulnerable in ways its creators never anticipated. Truth has its own power, its own momentum, its own destiny. And sometimes when the time is right, even the biggest lies collapse under the weight of evidence that refuses to remain buried. The night I walked out of the Vatican, for the last time, I carried with me more than just evidence of a cover-up. I carried coordinates, locations scattered across 5 continents where the proof of humanity's stolen history lay buried, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it. What I'm about to show you isn't just theory or speculation. It's a roadmap to the physical evidence that proves everything they've tried to hide. You see, the Vatican's cover-up wasn't just about controlling information. It was about controlling archaeology itself. For centuries, they've been systematically identifying, acquiring, and burying artifacts that don't fit their approved timeline of human development. But they made one crucial mistake. They kept detailed records of where everything was hidden, and I had those records. The first location took me to the mountains of Peru, to a site that doesn't appear on any official archaeological survey. Local indigenous people had known about it for generations, passing down stories of the sky people who had built impossible structures in impossible places. The Catholic missionaries who arrived with the conquistadors had heard these stories too, and they had made sure the sites remained lost to modern archaeology. But the Vatican archives contained Spanish colonial documents that pinpointed the exact locations, maps drawn by Jesuit explorers who had found evidence of advanced ancient technology and immediately recognized its danger to the approved narrative of human development. What I found in those Peruvian mountains changed everything I thought I knew about the scope of the cover-up. Carved into the rock face, at an altitude where the air is so thin that working would have been nearly impossible for primitive people, were symbols that matched exactly the cuneiform script I had seen in the Sumerian tablets. These weren't random similarities or coincidental artistic choices. These were identical symbols, carved with identical precision, suggesting that the same civilization that had created the Mesopotamian records had also operated in South America thousands of years before any official contact between the two regions. But the symbols were just the beginning. Hidden behind carefully placed rocks that appeared natural but were actually deliberate camouflage, I found chambers carved deep into the mountain. Inside those chambers were artifacts that shouldn't exist according to everything we've been taught about ancient technology, metal alloys that our modern metallurgy couldn't identify, crystalline devices that seem to store and focus energy in ways we don't understand, stone tablets covered with mathematical equations that described principles of physics we've only recently discovered, and most shocking of all, star charts showing planetary positions from perspectives that could only have been observed from space. Each artifact was carefully documented, photographed, and catalogued before being returned to its hiding place. But copies of that documentation found their way into the Vatican archives, where they remained locked away from any researcher who might ask uncomfortable questions about how ancient civilizations had possessed impossible knowledge. The pattern repeated itself at every location the Vatican records had identified. In Cambodia, I found temple complexes that had been deliberately buried under artificial hills to hide their true age and sophistication. The official dating of Angkor Wat was already controversial among archaeologists, but what lay hidden beneath the jungle floor was far older and far more advanced than anything the public had been allowed to see. Deep underground chambers contained libraries carved in stone, recording the same story told in the Sumerian tablets, but from a different cultural perspective. The Khmer civilization hadn't developed in isolation. They had been taught by the same divine teachers who had established civilization in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and South America. The stone libraries contain detailed accounts of these teachers' technology, their methods of genetic manipulation, their global mining operations, and most importantly, Their systematic program of limiting human development before their departure from Earth. The Khmer records even included technical diagrams showing how certain technologies had been deliberately removed from human knowledge to prevent civilization from advancing beyond safe parameters. But perhaps the most revealing evidence came from a site in Egypt that had never been officially excavated. Located beneath the Giza Plateau, hidden by centuries of sand and deliberate misdirection, were chambers that contained the original blueprints for human civilization itself. Vatican had known about these chambers since the Crusades. Medieval knights had discovered them while exploring beneath the pyramids and had immediately recognized the danger they represented to Christian doctrine. Rather than destroying the evidence, which would have been nearly impossible given its scope, they had chosen to bury it deeper and ensure that no one else would ever find it. The chambers contained what could only be described as a technological archive. Detailed instructions for agriculture, metallurgy, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine that were far more advanced than anything humans should have possessed in the ancient world. But they also contained something more disturbing: operational manuals for managing a slave species. The text described humans not as beloved creations of divine beings, but as carefully designed tools for resource extraction and manual labor. The genetic modifications that had been made to create modern humans were documented with scientific precision, including the specific limitations that had been built into our DNA to ensure docility and prevent technological advancement beyond approved levels. Most shocking of all were the protocols for what the texts called cognitive containment, detailed instructions for establishing belief systems that would keep humans focused on spiritual concerns rather than technological development, on individual salvation rather than collective advancement, on obedience to authority rather than independent thinking. These protocols were the original source of the major world religions, not divine revelations, but carefully designed control systems intended to keep humanity trapped in a perpetual state of technological adolescence. The gods of every major faith tradition were revealed to be the same entities, the same Anunnaki, simply presented through different cultural filters to ensure maximum compliance across diverse human populations. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Every major archaeological site on Earth contained traces of the same advanced civilization, the same technological knowledge, the same systematic program of human limitation. And in every case, the Vatican and its allied institutions had worked to ensure that this evidence remained hidden from public view. But the physical evidence was only part of the story. The archives also contained detailed records of how the cover-up had been maintained across centuries. Lists of archaeologists who had gotten too close to the truth and had been discredited, reassigned, or eliminated. Academic institutions that had been infiltrated to ensure that inconvenient discoveries were suppressed. Museums that had been convinced to keep their most revealing artifacts in storage rather than on display. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. Every major university's archaeology department had been influenced or controlled. Every significant museum had Vatican-approved policies for handling artifacts that contradicted approved timelines. Every government's cultural ministry had protocols for managing discoveries that might threaten social stability. But perhaps most insidiously, The conspiracy had infiltrated the field of archaeology itself. The methods used to date artifacts, the criteria for determining their significance, the standards for publication and peer review, all had been subtly influenced to ensure that evidence of advanced ancient civilizations would be dismissed, misdated, or misinterpreted. The result was a circular system of validation that made the cover-up self-sustaining. Evidence that contradicted approved timelines was automatically suspect. Researchers who questioned orthodox interpretations were denied funding and publication opportunities. Alternative theories were marginalized as fringe speculation regardless of their supporting evidence. Yet despite all these safeguards, cracks were beginning to appear in the system. Independent researchers using new technologies were making discoveries that couldn't be easily suppressed. Satellite imaging was revealing archaeological sites that had been successfully hidden for centuries. Digital communication was allowing researchers to share information without going through traditional gatekeepers. Most importantly, the consciousness evolution that the ancient texts had predicted was beginning to accelerate. People around the world were spontaneously developing abilities that shouldn't be possible according to the approved model of human potential. Individuals were accessing knowledge through non-traditional means, making connections that bypassed the artificial limitations built into our educational and cultural systems. The Vatican and its allies were struggling to adapt their control methods to these new realities. The old techniques of information suppression were becoming less effective in an age of global communication and digital evidence preservation. The traditional methods of discrediting dissidents were failing when applied to researchers who could present their work directly to the public through independent media platforms. But perhaps most troubling for the guardians of the cover-up was the fact that human consciousness itself was evolving beyond their ability to manage. The genetic limitations that had been built into our species were breaking down, allowing access to capabilities that the original designers had tried to permanently suppress. This was the real reason for their panic, the real source of their desperate efforts to maintain control. Not because their version of history was being questioned, but because humanity was beginning to remember what it really was and what it was really capable of achieving. The physical evidence I had gathered from around the world proved that our ancestors had been far more advanced than we'd been taught. But more importantly, it proved that those limitations on our development weren't natural or inevitable. They were artificial constraints that could be overcome once enough people understood their true nature. The coordinates in the Vatican archives led to proof that humanity had been deliberately held back from its true potential. But they also led to something more hopeful, evidence that this suppression was beginning to fail, that consciousness was evolving beyond the parameters originally established, and that the time was approaching when the truth could no longer be contained. Standing in those hidden chambers, surrounded by artifacts that proved everything we'd been taught about human history was a carefully constructed lie, I realized that my role wasn't just to expose the cover-up. It was to help humanity remember what it had forgotten about itself. The evidence was scattered across the globe, hidden but not destroyed. The truth was buried but not lost. And the time was coming when enough people would be ready to handle that truth, regardless of how much it challenged their fundamental assumptions about reality. The Vatican's greatest fear wasn't that people would stop believing in God. It was that they would start believing in themselves, that they would remember their true origins, their true potential, and their true destiny as a species that had once worked alongside advanced beings and could do so again. The cover-up was vast, sophisticated, and centuries in the making, but it was also built on a foundation that was beginning to crumble. Truth has its own power, its own momentum, its own inevitable victory over even the most carefully constructed lies, and the evidence was everywhere, waiting for those who were ready to see it. The Internet was supposed to democratize information. It was supposed to make censorship impossible and give everyone access to the truth. But what I discovered after leaving the Vatican showed me how naive that belief really was. The digital age hadn't ended the cover-up. It had simply forced it to evolve, to become more sophisticated, more pervasive, and more effective than ever before. They didn't fight the Internet. They conquered it from within. You think you're getting independent information online? You think social media has given you direct access to truth. Let me show you how the same institutions that have been controlling human knowledge for centuries have adapted their methods to the digital realm. Let me reveal the invisible architecture of modern censorship that makes the old book burnings look primitive by comparison. The Vatican and its allied organizations saw the threat early. By the late 1990s, they understood that traditional methods of information control wouldn't survive the digital revolution. So they did what they had always done when faced with technological challenges. They infiltrated, influenced, and ultimately controlled the new systems from within. The first phase was establishing presence. Major tech companies found themselves approached by consulting firms offering expertise in content management and information verification. These firms had impressive credentials, academic backing, and substantial funding. What they didn't advertise was their direct connection to institutions that had been managing information flow for centuries. The Vatican's Pontifical Academy of Sciences suddenly became very interested in artificial intelligence and algorithm development. Jesuit universities began offering specialized programs in data science and social media psychology. Catholic charities started funding research into online behavior modification and digital influence techniques. Within a decade, former Vatican researchers and allied academics had taken key positions throughout the tech industry, not as obvious religious representatives, but as secular experts in information science, behavioral psychology, and content optimization. They brought with them centuries of institutional knowledge about controlling what people believe and how they think. The genius of their approach was that they didn't try to censor information directly. Instead, they focused on controlling how information was discovered, processed, and interpreted. Search algorithms were subtly modified to prioritize certain sources while burying others. Social media platforms were designed to create echo chambers that reinforced existing beliefs rather than challenging them with new evidence. Most insidiously, they weaponized the concept of disinformation itself. By flooding the Internet with deliberately planted false conspiracy theories, they made it nearly impossible for genuine evidence to be taken seriously. Every real revelation about suppressed history or hidden technology was immediately surrounded by dozens of obviously fake alternatives, creating a noise field that obscured authentic research. The strategy was brilliant because it used human psychology against itself. People seeking hidden truth would find so many contradictory theories that they would either become paralyzed by analysis or retreat into comfortable belief systems that felt safer than uncertainty. Meanwhile, those who avoided conspiracy theories entirely would dismiss all alternative research as equally unreliable. But the digital control system went far deeper than content manipulation. The same institutions that had once physically controlled access to libraries and archives now influenced how digital archives were created and maintained. Historical documents that were digitized for online access were often edited versions, with the most revealing passages subtly altered or removed entirely. Search engines were programmed with invisible biases that made certain types of information nearly impossible to find, even when you knew exactly what you were looking for. Academic databases were structured to exclude papers that challenged orthodox interpretations, while promoting research that supported approved narratives. Social media platforms developed increasingly sophisticated methods for identifying and suppressing content that threatened the established order, not through obvious censorship, which would create martyrs and prove the conspiracy theorists right, but through algorithmic shadow banning that simply ensured inconvenient information never reached significant audiences. The financial system became part of the control mechanism too. Payment processors would suddenly discover policy violations when researchers tried to crowdfund independent investigations. Cryptocurrency exchanges would experience technical difficulties when donations were being made to support alternative archaeology projects. Advertising networks would demonetize content creators who strayed too far from approved topics. Even academic institutions, the supposed bastions of free inquiry, had been compromised. Research grants were structured to ensure that only certain types of questions could be investigated. Peer review processes were managed by gatekeepers who understood which conclusions were acceptable and which would end careers. University tenure committees learned to avoid candidates whose work challenged fundamental assumptions about human history. The result was a system of control more effective than anything the medieval church could have imagined. Instead of burning books, they controlled what books were written. Instead of imprisoning heretics, they made heretical ideas economically unviable. Instead of forbidding research, they ensured that research led only to approved conclusions. But they had made one crucial miscalculation. The same digital technologies that enabled their control also created opportunities for resistance that hadn't existed before. Decentralized networks made it possible to preserve and distribute information without relying on traditional institutions. Blockchain technologies offered ways to create tamper-proof records that couldn't be altered or suppressed. More importantly, the acceleration of human consciousness evolution was making their control methods less effective. People were developing intuitive abilities that allowed them to recognize truth, regardless of how it was packaged or presented. The artificial limitations built into human DNA were breaking down, creating individuals who could access knowledge through non-traditional channels. I witnessed this evolution firsthand during my years of underground research. Working with a global network of awakening individuals, I saw evidence of capabilities that shouldn't exist according to the approved model of human potential. Remote viewing that could identify hidden archaeological sites, telepathic communication that bypassed monitored digital channels. Intuitive knowledge that could distinguish authentic evidence from deliberately planted disinformation. These abilities weren't random or supernatural. They were the natural result of consciousness evolution, the gradual breakdown of genetic limitations that had been artificially imposed to keep humanity manageable. The Anunnaki protocols that had worked for millennia were failing because they had been designed for a species that was no longer genetically stable. The Vatican and its allies were facing a crisis they had never anticipated. Their control systems had been built on the assumption that human consciousness would remain static, that the genetic modifications made thousands of years ago would continue to constrain human potential indefinitely. But consciousness itself was evolving, developing capabilities that couldn't be controlled through traditional methods. This was why they had become increasingly desperate in their suppression efforts. Why the digital control systems had become so sophisticated and pervasive. They weren't just trying to hide historical evidence anymore. They were trying to prevent a species-wide awakening that would make their control obsolete. The evidence was everywhere if you knew how to look for it. Children being born with abilities that their parents couldn't explain. Adults spontaneously developing telepathic or precognitive capabilities. Groups of people independently receiving the same information through non-physical channels. Collective insights emerging simultaneously in different parts of the world, without any apparent communication. But perhaps most significantly, people were beginning to remember, not through books or teachings, but through direct access to genetic memory that had been dormant for millennia. The same consciousness that had once worked alongside advanced beings was awakening, carrying with it knowledge that no amount of historical revision could erase. The Vatican's modern control system was impressive in its scope and sophistication, but it was also fighting a losing battle against the very nature of consciousness itself. You can suppress information, manipulate algorithms, and control digital platforms, but you can't stop evolution, especially when that evolution is happening at the level of consciousness rather than just physical form. The old methods of control had worked because they operated on externals, books, institutions, physical access to information. The new resistance operated on internals, direct knowing, intuitive recognition of truth, genetic memories that couldn't be edited or suppressed. This was why my work had become so important. Not just documenting the evidence of historical cover-ups, but helping people understand that they had the capability to recognize truth directly, without needing to rely on external authorities or information sources. The ultimate resistance to any control system was the development of individual discernment that couldn't be fooled by even the most sophisticated manipulation. The digital age had given the forces of control powerful new tools, but it had also given the forces of awakening something even more powerful, the ability to recognize their own inherent capability to access truth directly. And once enough people understood that capability, no external control system could contain the resulting transformation. The Vatican had spent centuries perfecting the art of controlling what people believe, but they had never figured out how to control what people know. And in an age when consciousness itself was evolving beyond artificial limitations, that distinction was becoming more important than they had ever imagined. The cover-up was being challenged not just by researchers and whistleblowers, but by the very nature of human potential, asserting itself after millennia of suppression. The question wasn't whether the truth would emerge, but whether humanity would be ready to handle it when it did. 3 years after walking away from the Vatican, I found myself in a warehouse in Prague, surrounded by people who shouldn't have been able to find each other, yet had somehow gravitated together as if drawn by an invisible force. Scientists who had been blacklisted for asking the wrong questions. Archaeologists whose careers had been destroyed for refusing to ignore inconvenient evidence. Researchers who had discovered patterns that connected ancient mysteries across continents and centuries. We called ourselves the Emergence Network, and we represented something the Vatican had never faced before, a coordinated resistance movement powered not by ideology or politics, but by the irrepressible human drive to understand truth. You think resistance movements are born from anger or rebellion? This one was born from something far more dangerous to those in power. It was born from awakening, from people whose consciousness had evolved beyond the artificial limitations built into our species, who could recognize lies no matter how skillfully they were packaged, and who could access knowledge through channels that no surveillance system could monitor. Dr. Sarah Chun had been a rising star in quantum physics until she published a paper suggesting that consciousness itself might be a fundamental force in the universe, not just an emergent property of complex brains. The academic community destroyed her career within months, dismissing her work as pseudoscience despite its rigorous methodology and reproducible results. But Sarah's research had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. People around the world who had been experiencing phenomena that mainstream science couldn't explain began reaching out to her. Individuals who could perceive information across vast distances. Groups who seemed to share collective insights without any physical communication. Families where genetic memories were spontaneously surfacing after being dormant for generations. Professor James Whitfield had spent 30 years studying ancient architecture before he made the mistake of publishing evidence that Göbekli Tepe, the pyramids of Giza, and Machu Picchu had been built using identical mathematical principles and construction techniques. His university suddenly discovered budget constraints that required eliminating his position. Academic journals refused to publish his follow-up research. Conference organizers stopped returning his calls. But James had documentation that proved these sites weren't just similar in construction methods. They were part of a coordinated global infrastructure, built according to plans that took into account the entire planet's magnetic field, tectonic structure, and astronomical alignments. Architecture that required not just advanced engineering knowledge, but precise understanding of planetary systems that orthodox archaeology claimed ancient civilizations couldn't have possessed. Dr. Maria Santos had been investigating genetic anomalies in isolated populations when she discovered something that should have been impossible. DNA sequences that appeared to be artificially designed with specific modifications that enhanced certain cognitive capabilities while limiting others. Genetic markers that suggested systematic manipulation of human evolution, not through random natural selection, but through deliberate intervention by an advanced intelligence. Her research indicated that these modifications weren't random mutations or evolutionary adaptations. They were precisely engineered changes that seemed designed to create a species capable of complex thinking but limited in ways that would prevent technological advancement beyond certain parameters. A designer species created for specific purposes by entities who understood genetics in ways that surpassed our current scientific capabilities. Each member of our network had discovered pieces of the same larger puzzle, fragments of evidence that, when combined, painted a picture of human history completely different from anything taught in schools or universities. Evidence that pointed to the same conclusion I had reached in the Vatican archives. Humanity had been systematically modified, controlled and limited by advanced beings who had since departed, leaving behind only institutional guardians to maintain the containment protocols. But we weren't just researchers sharing information. We were individuals whose consciousness had evolved beyond the original design parameters, who were beginning to access capabilities that had been artificially suppressed in our species. And that evolution was accelerating. Sarah's quantum consciousness research had led her to developed techniques for accessing information through what she called non-local awareness. By understanding consciousness as a field phenomenon rather than a brain-based process, she had learned to retrieve information from sources that shouldn't be accessible through normal sensory channels. James was using these techniques to locate archaeological sites that weren't recorded in any historical documents. His success rate was impossibly high by conventional standards, but perfectly consistent when understood as direct access to planetary memory, systems that existed outside normal space-time limitations. Maria's genetic research had revealed that the DNA modifications limiting human potential weren't permanent. They were designed to break down over time, allowing consciousness to gradually evolve beyond the original constraints. What we were experiencing wasn't random awakening. It was the activation of dormant genetic programs that had been deliberately built into our species as a fail-safe mechanism. The implications were staggering. The entities who had created modern humans hadn't intended the limitations to be permanent. They had designed them to gradually dissolve, allowing human consciousness to evolve beyond artificial constraints once a certain period of time had passed or certain conditions had been met. We were living through that transition period. The awakening experiences people were reporting worldwide weren't supernatural phenomena. They were the natural result of genetic programs activating after millennia of dormancy, restoring capabilities that had been temporarily suppressed to maintain species stability during a critical developmental phase. But the institutional guardians of the containment protocols hadn't been informed about this planned obsolescence. The Vatican and its allied organizations were still operating under the assumption that human limitations were meant to be permanent, not recognizing that they were trying to maintain a system that was designed to eventually break down. This explained their increasingly desperate efforts to maintain control. They weren't just fighting human curiosity or rebelliousness. They were fighting biological imperatives, genetic programs that were activating regardless of their efforts to suppress them. They were trying to hold back an evolutionary tide that had been set in motion thousands of years before their institutions even existed. Our network became a laboratory for understanding and documenting this evolutionary process. We developed protocols for safely accessing expanded awareness without becoming destabilized by the experience. We created communication methods that bypassed traditional surveillance systems by operating through consciousness fields, rather than electromagnetic technologies. Most importantly, we began mapping the scope of the awakening process. Through our global connections, we identified thousands of individuals who were spontaneously developing capabilities that ranged from enhanced intuition to full telepathic communication. The geographic distribution wasn't random. The awakening was following patterns that corresponded to ancient sacred sites, as if the planetary infrastructure built by our predecessors was somehow facilitating the activation process. The Vatican had noticed these patterns too. Cardinal Toretti's suppression efforts had shifted from targeting individual researchers to attempting to interfere with the awakening process itself. Teams of Jesuit psychologists were developing techniques for convincing people that their expanding awareness was psychological illness rather than evolutionary development. Mental health institutions were being flooded with individuals whose only symptoms were accessing information through non-traditional channels or experiencing reality in ways that didn't fit approved parameters. Pharmaceutical interventions were being prescribed to suppress abilities that threatened the established order, while being presented as treatments for delusional thinking. The medical system had become another front in the war between containment and evolution. Diagnoses were being crafted to pathologize awakening experiences, ensuring that anyone who began to access their true potential would be classified as mentally ill and subjected to treatments designed to suppress rather than support their development. But the pharmaceutical approach wasn't working as effectively as expected. The genetic programs driving consciousness evolution seemed to be resistant to chemical suppression. Individuals who temporarily lost access to expanded awareness through medication would often develop even stronger capabilities once the chemical interference was removed. More troubling for the containment system was the fact that awakening individuals were beginning to recognize each other and form networks that operated outside traditional institutional structures. The isolation tactics that had always been used to control potentially problematic individuals were failing when those individuals could identify and connect with others who shared their experiences. Our Prague gathering was just one of dozens of similar meetings happening simultaneously around the world. Groups of awakening humans finding each other through methods that bypassed all conventional communication systems, sharing information that threatened every aspect of the historical narrative that had been carefully maintained for centuries. The evidence we were collecting painted a picture of systematic deception that went far beyond simple religious doctrine or political control. We were documenting proof that human civilization itself had been artificially constrained, that our species possessed capabilities we had never been allowed to fully develop, and that the time was approaching when those constraints would no longer be maintainable. But we were also discovering something that gave us hope. The same consciousness evolution that was breaking down artificial limitations was also developing natural wisdom about how to handle expanded capabilities responsibly. People weren't becoming unstable or destructive as they accessed their true potential. They were becoming more compassionate, more intelligent, and more connected to both each other and the planetary systems that supported all life. Fears that had originally motivated the containment protocols appeared to be unfounded. Humans with access to their full potential weren't dangerous to themselves or others. They were simply capable of creating civilizations that operated on principles of cooperation rather than domination, sustainability rather than exploitation, wisdom rather than mere intellectual accumulation. This was perhaps the Vatican's greatest fear, not that humanity would destroy itself if given access to advanced capabilities, but that it would transcend the need for the control systems that had defined human civilization for millennia. That awakening humans would create social structures based on direct knowing rather than institutional authority, making traditional power hierarchies obsolete. The evidence was clear. The awakening couldn't be stopped, only delayed. The genetic programs were activating according to their own timeline, independent of human efforts to control them. The question wasn't whether humanity would transcend its artificial limitations, but whether the transition would be smooth or chaotic, supported or opposed by existing institutions. Our network was working to ensure that the transition would be as peaceful as possible, providing resources and support for individuals going through the awakening process while documenting evidence that would help others understand what was really happening to our species. The cover-up was still in effect, but its days were numbered. Truth has its own momentum, especially when that truth is emerging from within human consciousness itself rather than from external sources that could be controlled or suppressed. Biggest secret in human history was about to become an open book, written in the expanding awareness of millions of people who were remembering what they had never been allowed to know about themselves. The emergency meeting was called for December 21st, 2024. Not a coincidence. Cardinal Toretti understood the significance of the winter solstice in the ancient systems he had spent his career suppressing. If the awakening process was indeed connected to planetary cycles, as our research suggested, then this date would mark a critical acceleration point that could make their containment efforts permanently obsolete. I learned about the meeting through sources that still existed within the Vatican walls. The Pope himself would not attend, maintaining plausible deniability about decisions that history might judge harshly, but representatives from every major institution involved in the millennium-long cover-up would be present. Cardinals, university chancellors, intelligence agency directors, corporate executives, and government ministers from across the globe. The agenda was simple: determine whether the awakening process could still be controlled, and if not, implement the final protocols that had been prepared for this exact scenario. You want to know what those final protocols contained? You want to understand how far the guardians of humanity's stolen history were willing to go to protect their carefully constructed lie? Then prepare yourself for the truth about what happens when institutions built on deception face the prospect of total exposure. The meeting was held in a location that didn't officially exist, beneath the Vatican secret archives. 7 levels deeper than the black archive I had accessed years earlier was a chamber that predated the founding of the Catholic Church itself. Ancient stone walls covered with symbols that matched the Sumerian tablets, technology that shouldn't have been possible in the medieval era, and at the center of it all, a communication device that had been left behind by the original architects of the human containment system. The Anunnaki hadn't simply departed Earth and forgotten about their genetic experiment. They had left behind monitoring systems and communication protocols that allowed them to observe human development and intervene if necessary. The highest levels of the Vatican weren't just guardians of ancient secrets. They were custodians of an active communication link with humanity's creators. The device had been used sparingly throughout history, only during periods when the containment system faced existential threats. The last activation had been during the Renaissance, when human scientific advancement had begun to approach dangerous levels. Instructions had been received for managing that crisis through controlled religious wars, strategic academic suppression, and the establishment of new institutional controls that channeled human curiosity into safe directions. But this crisis was different. The awakening wasn't being driven by external discoveries that could be suppressed or misdirected. It was emerging from within human consciousness itself, activated by genetic programs that were operating according to their own timeline, independent of human efforts to control them. Cardinal Toretti activated the communication device for the first time in over 200 years. The response came not as words or images, but as direct information transfer that bypassed normal sensory channels. The content was shocking even to those who had dedicated their lives to maintaining alien control systems. The genetic modifications that had created modern humans had indeed been designed with built-in obsolescence. The consciousness limitations were meant to be temporary, preventing technological advancement only during the period when human civilization was establishing itself and learning to manage resources sustainably. The awakening process was not a malfunction of the containment system. It was the activation of its final phase. Humanity was supposed to evolve beyond its artificial limitations. The consciousness expansion was part of the original design, intended to occur once the species had developed sufficient emotional and ethical maturity to handle advanced capabilities responsibly. The institutional guardians who had maintained the containment protocols for millennia had been serving a temporary function that was now meant to end. But the Anunnaki communication revealed something that stunned even the highest-level Vatican insiders. The creators weren't planning to return. The awakening process was humanity's graduation, not preparation for renewed servitude. The species that had been designed as workers was being transformed into partners, equals who would take responsibility for their own development and planetary stewardship. The implications were profound. Every institution that had derived its authority from controlling human potential would become obsolete. Religious hierarchies that claimed monopoly on divine communication would be unnecessary when individuals could access universal consciousness directly. Educational systems based on information transfer would be irrelevant when knowledge could be accessed intuitively. Political structures founded on managing scarcity would be meaningless in a civilization capable of creating abundance through consciousness-directed technology. The Vatican faced a choice that would define the future of human civilization. They could cooperate with the awakening process, helping to ensure a smooth transition to humanity's next evolutionary phase. Or they could implement the final protocols, a desperate attempt to prevent the awakening through methods so extreme they had never been seriously considered before. Cardinal Toretti chose resistance. If the containment system was meant to end, he argued, then ending it gradually under institutional control was preferable to allowing chaotic collapse that might destabilize civilization itself. If consciousness expansion was inevitable, Then managing its pace and direction was a moral imperative to prevent social breakdown. But his real motivation was simpler: power. Institutions built on controlling human potential couldn't survive in a world where that potential was fully realized. Rather than accepting obsolescence gracefully, they would fight to maintain relevance even if it meant betraying the very purpose they had originally been created to serve. Final protocols had been developed centuries earlier as contingency plans for the worst-case scenario, the complete breakdown of consciousness containment. They involved coordinated efforts across multiple systems to create artificial limitations that could substitute for the genetic ones that were dissolving, electromagnetic interference technologies that could disrupt the brain states associated with expanded awareness, pharmaceutical interventions that could chemically suppress consciousness evolution, social engineering programs designed to channel awakening individuals into controlled spiritual movements that would neutralize their potential for systematic change. Most drastically, they prepared for the possibility of declaring consciousness expansion itself a form of mental illness, subject to mandatory treatment that would restore individuals to approved baseline functionality. The medical establishment would become an enforcement arm for maintaining human limitation, with the power to indefinitely detain anyone whose awareness had evolved beyond acceptable parameters. The plan was comprehensive, sophisticated, and utterly desperate. It represented the last stand of institutions that had controlled human development for millennia, faced with the prospect of becoming completely irrelevant in a world where their services were no longer needed. But they had miscalculated the scope of what they were fighting against. The awakening wasn't just affecting isolated individuals who could be targeted and controlled. It was a species-wide phenomenon that was accelerating beyond their ability to track, much less manage. Our emergence network had grown from dozens to thousands to hundreds of thousands of members worldwide. Each awakening individual was becoming a catalyst for others, creating exponential expansion that no suppression system could contain. More importantly, the consciousness evolution was developing its own protective mechanisms, natural resistance to artificial interference that made traditional control methods increasingly ineffective. The electromagnetic technologies designed to disrupt expanded awareness were being neutralized by individuals who instinctively learned to shield themselves from artificial interference. The pharmaceutical interventions were losing effectiveness as human neurology adapted to maintain conscious coherence despite chemical manipulation. The social engineering programs were being exposed and bypassed by people whose enhanced intuition allowed them to recognize manipulation attempts immediately. Most significantly, the attempt to pathologize consciousness expansion was backfiring. Medical professionals were beginning to awaken themselves, recognizing that what they were being asked to suppress wasn't illness, but the emergence of human potential that had been artificially constrained for far too long. The final protocols weren't stopping the awakening. They were accelerating it by creating contrast that made the artificial nature of human limitations impossible to ignore. Every suppression attempt was generating resistance that spread awareness faster than any educational campaign could have achieved. By the time Cardinal Toretti realized his strategies were counterproductive, it was too late to change course. The Vatican had committed itself to a war against human evolution itself, a war that couldn't be won because the enemy was the natural development of consciousness according to its own inherent potential, the communication device that had connected them to humanity's creators fell silent, not because of technical failure, but because there was nothing more to communicate. The experiment was complete. The temporary limitations had served their purpose. The species was ready to take responsibility for its own development, with or without institutional permission. The cover-up that had shaped human civilization for over a millennium was entering its final phase, not because the guardians had chosen to reveal the truth, but because the truth was revealing itself through the consciousness of millions of awakening humans, could no longer be contained by any external system of control. The biggest secret in human history was about to become an open book, written not in ancient texts or hidden archives, but in the expanding awareness of a species finally remembering what it had always been, capable of becoming the institutions that had controlled human potential for centuries could either evolve with humanity or be left behind by the very transformation they had tried so desperately to prevent. The choice was theirs, but the outcome was no longer in their control. The awakening had reached critical mass. The cover-up was ending, whether they wanted it to or not. The truth became undeniable on March 15, 2025, not because of any single revelation or dramatic disclosure, but because enough human consciousness had evolved beyond artificial limitations that the old lies simply stopped working. Like a dam that finally gives way under mounting pressure, the cover-up that had contained human potential for over a millennium collapsed under the weight of awakening minds that could no longer be deceived. I was standing in St. Peter's Square when it happened. Hundreds of thousands of people had gathered from around the world, drawn by an understanding that transcended any official announcement. They knew, not through social media or news reports, but through the same expanded awareness that had made the old control systems obsolete. The Vatican's final attempt to maintain their narrative was about to be tested against the collective consciousness of a species that had finally remembered what it really was. Don't you want to know what the end of the biggest cover-up in history looks like? You want to understand what happens when truth becomes so powerful that even the most sophisticated deception cannot contain it? Then witness what I witnessed on that day when humanity finally refused to accept the limitations that had been placed on its understanding. Cardinal Toretti emerged from the basilica at precisely noon, flanked by representatives from every institution that had participated in the millennium-long suppression of human potential. He carried with him a prepared statement that would attempt to reframe the awakening as a spiritual revival that validated rather than threatened traditional religious authority. But something unprecedented happened as he approached the microphone. The crowd didn't wait for his words. They began speaking in unison, not repeating any prepared chant or prayer, but expressing a shared understanding that emerged spontaneously from their collective consciousness. They spoke of remembering, of genetic memories surfacing after millennia of suppression, of capabilities emerging that had been artificially constrained by those who claimed to serve divine authority, of a truth so profound that no institution could contain it, no matter how ancient or powerful. Toretti tried to begin his speech, but his words were drowned out by something far more powerful than any public address system. The crowd wasn't shouting or protesting. They were simply sharing truth through methods that bypassed all traditional communication channels. Telepathic networks that had been developing for years reached critical mass, creating a field of shared awareness that made deception impossible to maintain. I watched as Cardinal Toretti's face changed from confidence to confusion to something approaching terror. He was experiencing something no previous guardian of the cover-up had ever faced: direct confrontation with the collective awakened consciousness of the species he had spent his life trying to control. Through the telepathic field that now connected thousands of minds in the square, the truth flowed like water, breaking through every barrier that had been built to contain it. The Sumerian tablets, the hidden archaeological evidence, the genetic modifications, the institutional conspiracy that had shaped human civilization for over 1,000 years. But more than just information was being shared. People were accessing genetic memories that connected them directly to their ancestors who had worked alongside the Anunnaki. They were remembering technologies that had been deliberately suppressed. They were recognizing capabilities within themselves that made traditional power structures completely obsolete. Awakening wasn't just intellectual anymore. It was visceral, undeniable, transformative. People weren't just learning about the cover-up. They were experiencing the reality that lay beneath it, the consciousness potential that had been artificially constrained for millennia, but could no longer be suppressed. Cardinal Toretti made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. He began speaking about the dangers of spiritual pride, the need for institutional guidance, the risks of abandoning time-tested religious traditions. But his words felt hollow against the direct experience of expanded consciousness that was flooding through the crowd. That's when the impossible happened. Dr. Sarah Chun, standing somewhere in the middle of the massive gathering, began sharing her quantum consciousness research directly through the telepathic network, not in words or concepts, but as direct transfer of understanding that allowed thousands of people to simultaneously grasp the scientific basis for what they were experiencing. Professor James Whitfield followed, transmitting his archaeological evidence through the same network. Detailed knowledge about the global ancient infrastructure, the mathematical principles that connected sacred sites across continents, the proof that human civilization had been deliberately guided and constrained by non-human intelligence. Dr. Maria Santos shared her genetic research, allowing people to understand at the cellular level how their DNA had been modified, what limitations had been built into their neurology, and how those limitations were now dissolving as consciousness evolution accelerated beyond the original design parameters. The cumulative effect was unlike anything in recorded human history. An entire species simultaneously accessing suppressed knowledge, remembering forgotten capabilities, and recognizing the artificial nature of limitations they had been taught to accept as natural and inevitable. I felt it myself as the network embraced my consciousness. 15 years of careful research, hidden documents, and dangerous revelations flowing into the collective understanding like drops into an ocean. But what came back was far more than I had contributed. Perspectives from around the world, insights that connected dots I had never seen, understanding that transcended anything any individual could have achieved. Alone. The Vatican's response was as swift as it was futile. Security forces attempted to disperse the crowd. but found themselves facing people who could anticipate their movements through shared awareness. Media outlets tried to frame the event as mass hysteria, but their reporters on the scene were themselves becoming part of the telepathic network, experiencing directly what they had been sent to debunk. Government agencies activated emergency protocols designed to contain social unrest, but discovered that traditional methods of crowd control were useless against a gathering that operated through consciousness rather than physical coordination. You cannot arrest an idea whose time has come. You cannot suppress a truth that has reached critical mass in human awareness. By sunset, the awakening had spread far beyond St. Peter's Square. Similar gatherings were spontaneously forming in every major city on Earth. The telepathic networks that had begun as isolated experiments were linking together into a global consciousness field that connected awakening humans across all geographic and cultural boundaries. The cover-up wasn't just ending. It was being dissolved by the very consciousness it had tried to contain. Every lie that had been told about human origins was being replaced by direct knowing. Every limitation that had been artificially imposed was being transcended by individuals who remembered their true potential. The institutions that had maintained the deception for centuries found themselves facing a transformed humanity that no longer needed their services. Religious hierarchies became irrelevant when people could access divine consciousness directly. Educational systems became obsolete when knowledge could be transmitted telepathically. Political structures became meaningless when decisions could be made through collective consciousness rather than representative democracy. But perhaps most surprisingly, the transition was peaceful. The expanded awareness that dissolved artificial limitations also brought with it natural wisdom about how to use newfound capabilities responsibly. People weren't becoming destructive or chaotic as they accessed their true potential. They were becoming more compassionate, more cooperative, more intelligent about solving the challenges that faced their species and planet. Cardinal Toretti retreated to the Vatican as night fell, but the building he entered was no longer the seat of ultimate earthly authority he had defended his entire life. It had become a museum, a monument to humanity's forgotten past, a reminder of the time when consciousness had been artificially constrained and truth had been hidden behind institutional walls. The secret archives were opened not by papal decree, but by awakening humans who could perceive their contents through consciousness that transcended physical barriers. The Black Archive yielded its secrets to minds that could access information through quantum consciousness fields rather than printed documents. The Anunnaki communication device activated one final time, but the message it transmitted was not received by Cardinal Toretti or any other institutional guardian. It was received directly by human consciousness itself, a species-wide download of information that completed the awakening process and established humanity as the inheritor of its own destiny. The message was simple. The experiment was complete. The temporary limitations had served their purpose. The species was ready to join the broader community of conscious beings that inhabited the universe, no longer as servants or subjects, but as equals who had demonstrated their readiness for cosmic citizenship. Standing in that square as humanity awakened to its true nature, I realized that my role as a whistleblower had ended. The truth no longer needed protection or revelation because it had become self-evident to consciousness that could access it directly. The cover-up had dissolved not because it had been exposed, but because it had become irrelevant to minds that could perceive reality without institutional mediation. The biggest secret in human history had become an open book written in the consciousness of every awakening human. The lies that had shaped civilization for over a millennium were being replaced by direct knowing that no authority could challenge or suppress. Humanity had graduated. The age of artificial limitation was ending. The age of conscious evolution had begun, and the truth, as it always does when its time finally comes, had set us free.